Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming and spending your lunch hour with us today. I hope that it's going to be an interesting conversation. And we were talking about the format for our time together, and I really want to make this as interactive as possible, so that it is as interesting for those of you who are in the room. But I will share a few remarks with you to begin with, and then we'll open it up to a broader Q&A. I'm just going to write this up for a second. But it's really such a pleasure to be here and to spend time with you today and share a little bit about the work that was just so kindly introduced. Indeed, I'm a lawyer and an anthropologist by training, and the focus of my work for the last 6 years or so has been trying to understand the intersection of technology and migration and how people on the move are experiencing the innovation at the world's borders. And I've always taken a comparative approach to these issues, and I indeed have been able to go to places where a lot of this technology is being tested out to try and stitch together a global story of what is happening, which ultimately culminated in the book. Pretty surreal to see it out there after 6 years worth of work or so, but I'm glad that it's there so people can hopefully engage with the work a little bit. But I do want to start off with a little bit of positionality. This is where my kind of anthropological lens will go, because I think it's important to kind of situate ourselves in what brings us to the work that we do. So for myself, like many in the room, I have my own migration story that animates why I ended up working in this space. But I also think a lot about how we actually do the work that we do, because when we're trying to understand a lot of these novel topics that are coming up when it comes to migration, human movement, human rights abuses, oftentimes it's very difficult to document this system of violence and oppression that is sometimes difficult to see, because it is fraught with opaque decision makers, secretive private sector players, and also having to make space for holding really difficult experiences that are happening at the world's borders that I think challenge our conception of common humanity. So how do we carefully and critically document this? And how do we actually ask some bigger questions as well? By this, I mean, I'm not a technologist by training. I am trained in law and in anthropology, and I quite randomly fell into tech and human rights work about 6-7 years ago. And for me, technology is a lens through which to try and understand power and how power operates in society, and how communities that have historically been marginalized are oftentimes shut out of the conversations that need to be had. But it's also about bigger questions that I want us to think about throughout our time together. Questions like whose perspectives matter when we innovate and which priorities take precedence. What does critical representation and meaningful participation in knowledge creation look like? Representation that actually also foregrounds people's agency and doesn't contribute to really problematic framings that have become pretty common, especially in conversations around migration. Little side note here, I've been really privileged to speak and get to know hundreds of people on the move over my years of work in this space. And I think holding people's stories is actually an incredible responsibility that we have to think about. The concept of story stewardship comes to mind. And visual depictions come into it as well. I will be sharing a few photos with you to illuminate my remarks, because I think it helps situate what we're talking about, because technology can oftentimes be very abstract. But for those of you in the room who might do work on visual representation generally, you'll be familiar with very problematic framings that are sometimes used to talk about migration. Sometimes people call this poverty porn. Essentially freezing people who are in distress in moments of crisis, putting them on a UN report or an academic article. Oftentimes it is racialized people who are the ones who are used to depict these moments of crisis. This is something that we don't do at the lab. We instead focus on the infrastructure, and also we work directly with colleagues on the move in specific ways that I will touch on at the end of my presentation. So I think the visuals and visual choices also matter a lot in terms of how we think about and talk about migration. And the last kind of big question I want to pose, and I know this might seem a bit strange coming from a lawyer, though I'm a reluctant lawyer, so I think I can pose it. Are human rights framings enough, or do they actually also silence the systemic and collective nature of the harms that we are concerned about? And are we actually creating space to create conversations around the abolition of technologies and possibly even the abolition of borders? So for me, in order to try and tell this global story of power and innovation and contestation and violence, I've been relying on the sometimes uneasy mix between law and anthropology. It's a slow and it's a trauma-centered methodology that has required years of being present in spaces where a lot of this occurs, in order to at least try and begin unraveling some of these strands that make up the complex spaces in which people's lives unfold. But what is actually happening at the border? Borders have historically been violent places. But unfortunately, an already violent global border policy is now sharpened through the use of digital technologies that are developed for the purposes of border control and migration management. So when I talk about migration technologies, I'm talking about this broad corpus of projects. It can include surveillance, like drones, thermal cameras, walls with sensors going up, but it also includes things like algorithms and different types of decision-making that's making its way into state processes, and also experimental projects that I will talk about throughout our time together. But what these technologies are doing is that they separate families, they push people into life-threatening terrain, and exacerbate the historical and systemic discrimination that's already a daily reality for so many people on the move. But borders are also a testing ground, especially for new technologies and different projects, because they're spaces where regulation is already deliberately limited. And there's this kind of anything goes frontier attitude that's used to inform the development and deployment of technology, often at the expense of people's lives. And so when we're trying to understand the impacts of all these new experimental high-risk projects, again, technologies like AI lie detectors, surveillance drones, automated decision-making, it's always important to bring it back to the broader ecosystem in which all of this is happening. And this is an ecosystem that's unfortunately replete with the criminalization of migration, with xenophobic policies and politicians making pronouncements on the daily these days about migration. Practices such as pushbacks that are leading to thousands of deaths at the border. Because now, basically at every single point of a person's migration journey, they are now impacted by risky, unregulated technologies. But I want to reflect specifically about what is actually happening in some of these contexts. And I'm going to first bring us to the US-Mexico border. I've spent quite a lot of time at the Arizona border because this is one of the sites where you can actually see a lot of this infrastructure firsthand. Oftentimes difficult to document a discriminatory algorithm or even a drone, but at the US-Mexico border, you can actually see some of this. So this is a surveillance tower. It uses artificial intelligence to create essentially a surveillance dragnet that has expanded the border into the Sonora Desert. And it is also an Israeli surveillance company, Elbit Systems. There's over 50 of these towers now that are dotted throughout the beautiful yet deadly Sonora Desert. And they are augmenting this kind of migration management regime and this focus on smart borders that has been in vogue at the US-Mexico frontier. My time in Arizona has largely been spent working with search and rescue groups, or Samaritan groups, we would also call them. And they're such a fascinating little ecosystem because a lot of them are actually run and done by retirees, people in their 70s and 80s who could, instead of being on a sun lounger, they are going into the Sonora Desert to drop water, to assist people in distress, and sometimes also to collect human remains. And I've been working with one group in particular called the Battalion Search and Rescue, which was started by James Holman, who was a former Marine, who felt compelled to start this group because of all the situation and all the violence that's been happening in the Arizona desert. But if you choose to read the book, you will see that I have had many surreal experiences over the last 6 years trying to document this work. But in one of the most surreal ones, in the spring of 2022, when I was with James and his group, literally on the sands of the Sonora, the US Department of Homeland Security announced that AI towers and drones are not enough, that they are going to be rolling out robo-dogs to augment the already growing surveillance regime at the border. You might have seen this on an episode of Black Mirror or another movie. It's very sci-fi. And there's something quite viscerally disturbing, I think, about this piece of technology. But again, the future is not just more technology, it unfortunately is more death. This is James that I mentioned from Battalion Search and Rescue, and we went to a memorial site of Mr. Alias Alvarado. He was a young husband and father from El Salvador who was in search of a better life and unfortunately succumbed to the desert mere kilometers away from a major highway. So states like to say that we need more technology, we need more surveillance, we need more robo-dogs to prevent people from coming into the territories, especially people that we so-called don't want. Except technologies don't work like that, and surveillance doesn't work like that. Instead, what happens is people who are in desperate situations and also exercising their internationally protected right to asylum, right that's available to all of us. Instead, people are forced to take more circuitous routes, oftentimes through increasingly dangerous terrain, leading to a nearly tripling of deaths since the introduction of smart border technologies at the US-Mexico frontier. So again, the robo-dog in and of itself is viscerally disturbing, but for me, what is most disturbing is the idea that people like Mr. Alias Alvarado will be pursued by military-grade quadruped technology like this. I also always show this photo because I think it's a great reminder of the arbitrariness of borders. This is, of course, the infamous Trump Wall. It bisects the United States and Mexico and runs along the El Camino del Diablo, Devil Highway. And you can drive up to it, you can touch it. Its rust will stay in your hand for the rest of the day, maybe as a reminder of its kind of physicality and hulking presence. But it also ends. And you can climb that little hill there and pop your head over to the other side. That's not a reminder of the arbitrariness of bordering. I don't know what is. The next photo I want to show can be a little bit difficult to look at, but I think it's an important one. Another area of the world that I've been privileged to get to know quite intimately is Greece. I went to Greece first in the summer of 2020, in the height of the COVID pandemic, to try and understand how COVID and surveillance was used to essentially weaponize migration and further make the situation more difficult for people who have been living in Greece for many years seeking asylum. And I thought, you know, like a proper ethnographer, I would stay for a few months, and then I stayed for 2.5 years. And Greece was an incredible jumping off point for other locations that I was able to cover in the book, but it also is such an important piece to the story to try and understand in and of itself. And for those in the room who study migration or who are interested in what's been happening, I'm sure you're familiar with the Mediterranean corridor or even the Aegean Sea, sites of border violence and death for many years where people have died in the thousands now. I think this year in particular, the highest number of deaths ever reported in the Mediterranean from people seeking asylum in small boats. But we sometimes forget about the land border. And this photo is from that region. It's called Evros, and it is between Greece and Turkey. And almost as a pilgrimage of sorts, when I'm in the region, I try and make this drive down to Sidero, this little village, which is actually really beautiful. It's surrounded by golden poplar trees, and outside of this village lies a cemetery. It's a cemetery of largely unmarked graves, but you'll notice that there are some inscriptions on a few of the tombstones. That's information that was sent to the imam of the village by the families of those who died, making the dangerous crossing into Europe. And last time I was there was a relatively fresh grave of a young woman who came from Syria and passed away. She was born in 1993, and there were still yellowing roses on her grave, perhaps as an act of care or recognition from the village. But as I was kind of kneeling down, paying my respects, something caught my eye. Something green and putrid. These 3 holes that were chewed out of the earth. 3 graves waiting. I think it's important to hold space for this context in and of itself to recognize the impacts of border violence, but also because this is yet another laboratory of high-risk tech experimentation. This is the region where drones are being used, where aerostat machines or blimps are flying all over, where a wall with sensors is being deployed, and where, again, experimental projects are being used, including a long-range acoustic device, essentially a sound cannon, that's sometimes used in protests that emits a piercing shriek to try and prevent people from even entering the territory in the first place. The last kind of category of technologies I just want to briefly touch on are carceral technologies. So this is a refugee camp. This is on the island of Kos, which is one of the so-called hotspots, the 5 islands kind of between Greece and Turkey that have been housing people who have been escaping violence for many years, particularly during the Syria war in 2015, 2016, but people continue arriving nearly daily. European Union has been funding these camps. They're called multi-purpose reception and identification centers, and they are now replete with all sorts of tech. It's the kind of, unfortunately, usual barbed wire, which has become pretty common in refugee camps. But there's now also biometrics at the door. There's drones flying overhead. At one point, there was even talk of virtual reality glasses for the border guards to wear to augment their reality and beam all of this data into a processing center in Athens. Interestingly enough, too, Kos in particular is the site of an experimental project from the Horizon 2020 Research Consortium called robo-border, which I love the names, by the way. I think there's a paper waiting to be written on the nomenclature of this. So we have robo-border. That, again, thousands of euros spent on this, is going to be introducing underwater, land and aerial robots to patrol this space. But I would urge us to think about where even a fraction of these resources would be better spent other than on surveillance technology. Samos Island was actually the first island where one of these high-tech refugee camps opened. And I've been going to Samos more times than I remember. And I was recently just there at the beginning of August to see what's changed. Because the camp that is full of this technology first opened in September of 2021. And before it opened, I really wanted to get a sense of how people were feeling, essentially facing a forcible transfer into one of these camps. And that's not to say that the previous living situation was any better, but the alternative is this high-risk, open-air, prison-like refugee camp that's far away from the city, far away from lawyers, psychosocial support, even the ability to take your child for a walk along the sea. And I spent quite a lot of time with a young mom, Asma, who was there with her daughter. And I was asking her how she felt about this transfer to this camp, and she typed this out so that my colleagues could also understand. And it says, if we go there, we will go crazy. I mean, if this is what the refugee camp looks like, we can understand why she might say that. But to me, it's also a reminder of some of those bigger questions that I've been trying to pose, particularly whose priorities matter here. So these camps are extremely expensive to run. Greece has taken on this responsibility, introduced all of this technology, some of which doesn't even actually work as intended. A lot of it is this kind of theater and performance of tech. But 2 weeks before opening, the Samos camp did not have running water. That tells us a lot about whose priorities are at play here. So I want to broaden it out a little bit and talk about some of the human rights impacts of this tech, and then broaden that even more to talk about what actually is happening and why, perhaps. I mean, we could spend an entire week talking about the different impacts of this technology. Even things like freedom of association, religion, and expression are impacted when we know that social media is being scraped, for example, and risk profiles are being created on people based on the mosque that they worship at or who they associated with before they even migrate. Freedom of movement obviously impacted, including really foundational principles of refugee law, such as the non-refoulement principle, this idea that is so foundational that says that we are not allowed to return somebody to an area where they might face persecution. That is obviously happening if we're talking about pushbacks, digital surveillance, and other types of violent technologies. And like liberty and security of the personnel, of course, also, not only in the carceral side with refugee camps, but also the fact that so many people are dying as a result of this kind of growing surveillance dragnet. But I want to focus on 2 areas largely, one being privacy rights and data protection, and the other being equality and freedom from discrimination. Privacy rights and data protection, really important area here, right? Because if we talk about the context again, the personal data that's being collected of people on the move is extremely sensitive. And it is very troubling that we don't currently have extremely strong guardrails in place to prevent data from being shared, stored, and misused. I'll give you a direct example. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is the UN agency that does a lot of the frontline work when it comes to humanitarian emergencies, sometimes even refugee processing. And like a lot of international organizations these days. More and more technology is making its way into the mix. So when Rohingya refugees were escaping Myanmar and ended up in Bangladesh, the UNHCR collected vast amounts of data. And then inadvertently, they say, they shared it with the Myanmar government, the very government that the refugees were trying to escape from. How can something like this happen? I mean, it really begs the question, what kind of regulation and governance is in place, and why are we even collecting this data in the first place? But it also makes me think of another area that I want to pose to you, and that is this idea of informed consent. We are seeing the huge rise of biometrics. So that is data that uses parts of your body for a collection. So that can include things like iris scanning, fingerprinting, even the way you walk or the pattern of your veins. And again, international organizations in particular have been really almost obsessed with biometrics under the guise of efficiency and trying to, get access for people to humanitarian services. And one of these technologies is iris scanning that has been used for a while in refugee camps, including the Azraq refugee camp in Jordan. And, on the face of it, it sounds pretty good, right? Instead of people having to have identity cards, they can have their irises scanned, they can get access to food, all good. Like, what's the problem? Except when you actually talk to people who are on the kind of receiving end of this technology, many have reflected to me that they don't feel comfortable having their irises scanned in order to get food. I mean, how would we feel, right, if we went to a grocery store and all of a sudden, instead of your tap card, you would have your eye scanned? The thing is, when you are in these spaces of vast power differentials, oftentimes you can't really say no, especially if the choice is, well, you either have your irises scanned or you don't eat that week. That's not really free and informed consent. The other area I want to briefly touch on is equality and freedom from discrimination. And technology is a social construct, like so many things, like law, like policymaking, like language, and it replicates the vast power differentials that are already inherent in our world. And it actually can exacerbate and create brand new biases in the way that information is fed in, the type of data that it uses, and the determinations that it makes on people on the move. We know, for example, that facial recognition does not work the same way on people who are darker skinned. We have seen the implications of this, for example, with the CBP-1 facial recognition app that's being used at the US-Mexico border. But I want to bring in another example, and that's the example of border control. Another great name, right? Because now we have an iPad, an iPhone, and border control. This was yet another Horizon 2020 pilot project with a university that was also involved, and I'll get to why that's important, because academia needs to be critiqued as well for its complicity in all of it. But essentially, this project tried to create, for lack of a better word, an AI lie detector. So it would use facial recognition and emotion expression analysis to make determinations about whether or not people were lying at the border, and then stream them for secondary processing. I mean, the technical experts in the room could tell us why this just doesn't even work in and of itself, and people have rightly critiqued it as snake oil technology. But I'm more interested in the kind of nuances around how would we analyze this from a human rights perspective, or even just a human perspective. So when I used to practice law in Canada, I remember instances where there were cases where I was working with people on the move who, for example, sometimes wouldn't feel comfortable making eye contact with a decision maker of the opposite gender, sometimes because of religion, sometimes just because of their experiences, or maybe even because of nerves. Human decision makers struggle with how to make sense of our kind of understandings of what a liar looks like or plausibility looks like. How can an AI lie detector deal with this? And perhaps even more subtly, what about the impact of trauma on memory? And the fact that we know that we don't still tell stories in a linear way anyway. Again, human judges really struggle with this. How can an AI lie detector deal with these kind of nuances? But really, we need to think about this holistically. And the thing is that this is happening at such a broad scale that the potential impact of it on people's lives and rights is extraordinary. But it is really about these broader questions to me that underpin what we innovate on and why. And really, we have to ask, when and why have we even decided that these are the appropriate tools to use? Particularly when we know that there is not a lot of adequate governance and accountability mechanisms in place right now for when things go wrong. Because immigration decisions are already opaque, discretionary, and sometimes hard to understand. I mean, legally speaking, you can have the exact same set of evidence presented to two officers, and they can come up with two completely different, yet equally legally valid decisions. Many of us, I'm sure, have also had unpleasant experiences at the border, where you know that there's so much power that a border official has. This is how the decision-making already operates. So what are we doing when we're augmenting or replacing human decision-making with any kind of automation? And, I've highlighted some of the sharpening, but things do actually go wrong. There's another case that I find particularly telling. In the UK, over 7,000 students were wrongfully deported because an algorithm made a mistake and accused them of cheating on a language acquisition test. Imagine that you're one of these students who's had their life turned completely upside down. And imagine that you actually have the resources to challenge this decision, which a lot of people don't even have, or even the knowledge that automation was used in your application. We are at that point where some people are just finding out about it, either by accident or because they retain a lawyer or they file an access to information request. But let's say you're one of the few that manages to cobble enough resources together to try and challenge this decision, this wrongful deportation as a result of an algorithm deciding that you shouldn't be here. Where does responsibility in this actually lie? Is it with the designer of the algorithm? Is it with the immigration officer using it? Is it the algorithm itself? Should an algorithm have personality in a court of law? I mean, these are questions that we're going to have to start thinking about and answering, because this is that kind of nexus where the impacts on the rights of people is so high and significant. And unfortunately, the safeguards that exist are very, very weak. But, if I had to sum up the last 6 years of my work in this space, which is hard to do, but I think it would actually be this. The lack of global governance, very few laws and procedures and policies that exist right now are not an accident, because they make the border and people on the move a viable testing ground for powerful actors to be able to experiment with technology that they wouldn't be allowed to in other spaces. But it's also underpinned by these broader logics. I don't want to go too theoretical, but I think it's helpful to think about, what does migration management even look like? Managing this kind of so-called problem of migration. If a person on the move, a refugee, a stateless person, a displaced person, is seen as a threat, a fraud, and as something to control, then it makes sense that we need these technical solutions to make people on the move trackable, intelligible, and knowable. And the political rhetoric around migration is heating up to such an extent that it makes sense that powerful actors are able to weaponize these anxieties around migration and say, well, since we have this problem, we need a technical solution to help us fix this. This kind of techno-solutionistic bend that is just everywhere these days. And it's also geopolitical, right? Countries are jostling for power on the global stage in what some colleagues have called an AI arms race. Everybody wanting to be a leader. You know what? I'll call myself out too. There's artificial intelligence on the title of my book, right? It's not really about AI, but it's the term in vogue. And we are all trying to find a way to kind of make ourselves relevant in this AI space. But to me, again, it's about the context that we're talking about and what this is actually doing, this kind of performance and spectacle of technology, because oftentimes it doesn't even work the way it's intended to. So what is this really about? It's about, again, these broader questions. Who is around the table to participate in conversations around proposed innovation? And who is shut out? Who is the experiment? Why have certain communities become testing grounds for technology? And ultimately, there's another major actor here that I do want to call out, and that's the private sector. The private sector time and again gets to determine what we innovate on and why, because states oftentimes cannot develop this technology in-house. So they rely on these sometimes very problematic public-private partnerships to make this happen. But when we know that there's now been a massive growth of what my wonderful colleague, Todd Miller, who's a journalist in Arizona, for those of you who are interested in this, I would urge you to take a look at his work. He's been working on this topic called the border industrial complex. And it has been estimated to be over $70 billion worth of different equipment, technologies that are being sold for the purposes of making a solution to a complex societal issue. And so if we know that a private sector actor has a very different bottom line, and that is to make money, and states are concerned about migration, that is the perfect marriage. And there is this kind of hubris, right, in big tech oftentimes, and this allure of a quick fix and a technical solution to very complex societal issues that just also, in the way that we are seeing technology proliferate, just simply do not address the very complicated reasons why people are forced or compelled to migrate in the first place. So if we know that this is the environment in which we're operating, it perhaps starts making a little bit more sense as to what priorities really take precedence when we choose to create sound cannons and robo-dogs and AI lie detectors and not use AI to root out racist border guards or to audit immigration decision-making. Again, it is a lens through which to understand these vast power differentials in this space. So I think the border and migration in and of itself is a fascinating area and an important one to really look at contextually. But the thing is, it doesn't just stop at the border. And I think perhaps that is why we all need to care about these issues. The robo-dogs that I mentioned at the US-Mexico border, a year later on TikTok, the New York City Police Department proudly announced that they want to roll out a fleet of robo-dogs on the streets of New York to keep New York safe. One was even painted white with black spots on it, like a Dalmatian. So I normally end my presentation there, but that's very depressing. So I did want to take just a few minutes before we have a discussion together to also ask how we can build a different world. And I want to highlight a project that we've been incubating at the Refugee Law Lab at York called the Migration Technology Monitor. This is something that we started in 2020 with Professor Tendai Ochume, who was then the UN Rapporteur on Discrimination. And we had first thought, it was going to be another archive and a platform to hold some of this work. But organically, it actually really grew into a community. And last year, for the first time, we started a fellowship program for colleagues on the move to support people with a living wage who are currently in different situations of displacement, to tell their own stories on what matters at the intersection of technology and migration. And it's been really eye-opening for me, partly also because as someone who really looks at the sharpest edges of the world, sometimes the depression and the dystopia can get very real. But this has been an incredible opportunity to also think about how do we create knowledge? How do we redistribute resources? How do we work in a more horizontal way that actually allows for knowledge to rise up from the ground, quite literally? And it's been interesting too to see the breadth of projects. So for example, my colleagues Veronica Martinez and Wael Khartipi are both journalists. Veronica is in Mexico and Wael is from Syria. He was stateless for many years in Malaysia and is now in Europe. They look at the kind of surveillance impacts on people on the move, somewhat similar to maybe what I do, the really kind of the human rights impacts of issues. Veronica has been looking at facial recognition at the US-Mexico border, and Wael has been doing surveillance work with his community. So we still definitely need a lot of investigative type work highlighting the human rights impact of these technologies. But there's another side to it too. For example, Nair Santaya, she is our chatbot expert. She has created a specific chatbot application for her community in Venezuela to assist people and connect them with lawyers, psychosocial supports, and community workers that they need. Rajendra Paudel, he's a former migrant worker from Nepal. He spent many years in the Middle East and was himself a victim of surveillance. He's now become essentially a social media influencer, much more of a social media savvy person than me. And he's created so many resources for his own community about the impacts of surveillance. And last but not least, my colleague Simon Drotti, who is a data analyst and a refugee living in Uganda. He created this really beautiful project called the Memory Scroll, which is essentially an online archive of storytelling for his community. And we were lucky because we launched the second cohort this year, and we're learning as we go, but we now have 5 additional colleagues, including from Palestine, South Africa, 2 from Sudan, and 1 from Mexico, doing all sorts of other projects on tech and migration. And this is a small intervention, but it is a concerted one. We also chose to specifically properly fund 5 people as opposed to 30 people, which maybe would look better in terms of metrics, but we really want to make sure that people are paid a living wage to be able to do the work that they feel is important in this space, and also to kind of problematize how we create knowledge and who counts as an expert. Because really, truly, the expertise that we need to pay attention to is what's happening on the ground by people who are experiencing border violence and technologies on the daily. So I want to thank you for coming and sharing your time and space with us today, and I hope that we can have a really interesting conversation for the remainder of our time together. Thank you.